What's up, guys? Welcome back to YOCF in the Wild. Hope you guys have enjoyed this series. If this is the first time you're jumping in with us, we've been going through Hebrews 11, which this passage is called the Hall of Faith. It talks about all these characters from the Bible who have just really contributed to God's story and the narrative of God's people in really big and significant ways. We've already looked at the story of Noah and Joseph, and today we're back for another one. So I hope you guys are tuning in, and remember the hope and the idea behind YOCF in the Wild is that you guys would be able to do youth group anywhere. So what we are encouraging you guys to do is grab a friend or grab a family member, and if this is in person or virtually, that is totally fine. And we hope that you guys will watch this video together. We have some discussion questions for you guys throughout this video that you guys will discuss those things and then just spend some time praying together. So again, we're kind of using Hebrews 11 as our starting point. If you haven't read that passage, I would recommend that you go do that right now. Seriously, like pause the video and go read that passage if you haven't already. But if you have read that, then we're going to move on and we're going to look at the next character that we're going to look at this time. So we are looking at the story of Sarah. Sarah is an important person in the Old Testament. She's one of only 2 women who are mentioned in the Hall of Faith. So she's a pretty significant person, especially as one of the first of 2 women that are mentioned in this passage here. So the story of Sarah is all the way at the beginning of the Bible. It starts all the way in Genesis 12. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open it up. We're going to look at Genesis 12. Her story goes all the way through Genesis 17. And I'm going to give you guys a second right now to just go ahead and read her story. Read the story of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was married to Sarah. Sarah was Abraham's wife. And see what happens in that story. So go ahead and pause the video with whoever you're with. And go ahead and read the story of Abraham and Sarah. Cool. Now that you guys have read the story of Sarah, a few things I want to point out. I'm going to give you a brief overview of her story and just some highlights, but there are a couple things that were really important to Sarah's story. And the first one is she was married to Abraham, who is this huge, massive character in the Old Testament. Abraham establishes this really important covenant with God, which is just a promise. God makes a promise to Abraham, and this is what he says to Abraham. The Lord said to Abraham, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." So this promise is given to Abraham, and at the time, and forever, Abraham and Sarah are married. So Sarah gets to be a part of this experience with Abraham. And she travels with Abraham, and she journeys with Abraham through this entire promise, the fulfilling of this promise that God makes to Abraham. And we get to see her reactions, and there are 2 things that we know about Sarah. She has kind of 2 major characteristics about who she is as a person, and the first one is this. The first mention of Sarah, a description of Sarah, is in chapter 12, verse 11. Abraham is talking to Sarah, his wife, and he says, "I know that you are beautiful. You are a woman beautiful in appearance." The first qualifier and identifier we get of Sarah is that she is very beautiful. And the second one is this. If you skip ahead a little bit to the next chapter, a few chapters, in chapter 16, it says that Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. So we know that Sarah was both beautiful and she was barren, which means she couldn't have kids. And in that time, it's not that it was a much bigger deal if you couldn't have kids back then than it is today. It had so many more social and religious implications, and there was a lot of stigma attached to people who couldn't bear kids. And so the world and the culture would look at somebody who was barren and couldn't bear kids and say that that person was unimportant, that they couldn't carry on the family name, which was the most valuable and important thing of that time. You couldn't contribute to those things, and you were kind of useless at that point if you were a woman and you couldn't carry on the family name. And so Sarah is an incredible character, but she had this huge character flaw. She had this huge kind of blot on her name that was saying that she was not valuable. So your first discussion question before we jump into her story and kind of what that means for us is, are there things, or what are the things that the world says about you that makes you feel less valuable? Again, for Sarah, it was that because she couldn't have kids, she was not important, she couldn't carry on the name, there was so much social and religious stigma and implications of that. But for us today, what is that? What is that for you? Maybe it's that you are too blank, or you're not blank enough, whatever that is. So I'll give you a second to pause this video and discuss those things with whoever you're with. Cool, welcome back. Glad you guys are back. Quick overview of Sarah's story. Sarah's story here. So Abraham and Sarah, God makes this covenant with Abraham, and at this point they're already pretty old. They're like, Abraham is 65, I think, 75, and he tells Abraham that he's gonna make him the father of many nations. So this is probably really good news for Sarah to hear, because she hasn't been able to have a kid up to this point. Now God is promising her husband that he's gonna have a lot of kids and that he's gonna be the father of all these nations. So they kind of go on this journey, and they end up leaving the land that they're going to go where God calls them to. They end up in Egypt, which is not where they were supposed to go. And the story is crazy. You should have already read the story, but it's like, it's honestly wild. There's like lying. She Abraham has a child with somebody else, and that was Sarah's idea. Crazy. Right? They pretend that they're brother and sister instead of husband and wife, and it gets them like into all sorts of trouble. And there's this other like mistress who's a part of this story. There's drama with like Sarah and her husband's baby mama, and she laughs at God like multiple times. So Sarah's story and Abraham, like, it's not a fairy tale. Actually, it's very pretty story at all. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of mistakes that they make. The decisions that they make sometimes are just like head scratching. Like, what are you thinking here? What are you trying to do? And it makes no sense when you think about the promise that God has given Abraham. Like, God promised that he was gonna give Abraham many children and many nations, and you would think that they would understand that means that they're probably safe. But no, they act out of fear in all these ways. They get exiled from Egypt and kicked out of this land. So it's kind of a crazy story here. But there's a couple things that we learn about Sarah that I think are really important for us to understand. The first one is this, is one, that she is one of the people who's mentioned in the Hall of Faith, and she is she makes so many mistakes. What I love about the inclusion of Sarah in the Hall of Faith is that she is human. Some of the other characters that we've looked at, and some of the other characters that are in the Hall of Faith, almost feel like superheroes, like perfect people, like righteous and holy and always doing the right things. And that's just not the case with Sarah. There's a lot of issues that she has, and she isn't a perfect person, but still she is mentioned as one of the most important characters in the Bible. And I think for us, that should bring us a lot of comfort to know that we don't have to be perfect people in order for us to be used by God. We don't have to be perfect people in order for God to view us in a way where we could be important people in God's story. And so maybe you have made mistakes. Maybe the world is telling you that you're not important and not valuable. Maybe you're trying to be faithful and you're just really struggling with it. If that's you, I would say that's okay. And it's okay because we have examples like Sarah who are in the Bible who struggled with all of those exact same things. And not only did they struggle with those things, but they overcame them, and God was still faithful to her, and God still used her in His grand narrative. That should bring us comfort. And the second thing is this: her two big character identifiers was that she was beautiful and that she was barren. But God came through with His promise. I can't imagine how it would feel to be Sarah to be in Sarah's shoes, especially because God makes this promise that they're gonna have a huge family and He's gonna bless them, but God doesn't do it immediately. It's literally decades later before Sarah is able to have her first child. Not only that, she's like almost 90 years old when she's able to have her first child. If I was Sarah, I would think, okay, God made this promise, but that was like so far in the past. Easily these doubts would start to creep into my mind. I'm sure she was thinking things like, okay, Abraham and God made this promise. Maybe I wasn't a part of that promise, or maybe we missed our chance, or I'm way too old now, there's no way that any of this is going to happen. All of those doubts would start to be swirling in my mind, and I'm sure for Sarah too. She was beginning to think, or had been thinking about those things for a long time. But the fact of the matter is she was still, God, in the midst of those doubts, in the midst of all that time, in the midst of those decades, God's promise was still true. That not in the way that Sarah and Abraham expected, but God was still able to fulfill His promise and bring Abraham and Sarah a child, and that's so important. So for us, I think through her barrenness, which was her biggest character flaw, we see redemption in God coming through with His promise. But I think for us, the big takeaway too is we can remember that God is always faithful. But the hard part for us is to remember that He's always faithful and not always faithful in the timing that we would want. Does that make sense? Like, if we ask for or want something to happen, we have a time frame in mind of when that should happen, right? Like, whatever, like, I want to be successful. Maybe that's a prayer that you have, but the success that you think that you want to have in your mind may not be the success that God has in store for you. Not only that, it might not happen at the time you think it should happen, right? And so, how do we remain faithful to remember that even if it doesn't happen when we want it to, that God is still faithful? That when our timing isn't met, that doesn't mean that God isn't faithful. Sarah and Abraham had to be patient for decades for this promise to come true. And there are so many promises that God has on our lives too. And I think the encouragement here for us is that we just need to continue to be patient in those promises being fulfilled in our lives too. So last discussion question for you guys. I want you to discuss this and then pray with each other. And think about what are the things that you're waiting for God to do for you? And what are the things that you think He hasn't done yet? And are you able to be patient in those times? Or is that a struggle? I know there are lots of things that have been really difficult for me when things didn't work out the way that I wanted them to in the timing that I wanted them to. And I think that's a very human experience. So what are those things for you? Talk about those things with whoever you're with, and then spend some time sharing your prayer requests and praying for each other. Thanks for coming to YOCF in the Wild. We'll see you next week. Love you.